April 9th, 1241. The fields outside Liegnitz, Silesia. A lone watchman sees dust on the horizon, then realizes the dust is an entire Mongol army, moving faster than any force Europe has ever faced. 10,000 riders, silent as a storm front. Inside the Christian camp, barely 300 armored knights mount their horses, knowing they are riding towards certain death. Moments from now, steel will collide with steppe fury, and Europe's fate will balance on a single impossible charge. The rumors came first. They arrived in whispers carried by merchants who had fled eastward-facing cities, by monks who had abandoned their monasteries, by farmers who had seen smoke on horizons that should have been clear. The stories were impossible. Entire kingdoms erased in weeks. Cities of 50,000 souls reduced to ash and bone. An army that moved faster than any force in living memory, that appeared where it could not be, that killed with a precision that felt almost supernatural. Europe had never seen anything like the Mongols. By the winter of 1240, the rumors had hardened into terrible certainty. The Mongol horde, commanded by Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis himself, and guided by the strategic genius of Subutai, the greatest general the steppes had ever produced, had crossed the Carpathian Mountains. They had split into multiple tumens, each a self-sufficient killing machine of 10,000 mounted archers. One wing swept into Hungary, another drove into Poland. They did not siege, they did not negotiate, they annihilated. Krakow fell so quickly that many in the West refused to believe it had happened at all. Sandomierz was burned so thoroughly that the smoke could be seen for 3 days in every direction. At Chmielnik, a Polish force tried to meet them in open battle. The Mongols feigned retreat, drawing the knights forward, then wheeled and destroyed them with clouds of arrows fired from horseback at full gallop. It was a kind of warfare Europe had no answer for. The Mongols killed not just armies, but the idea of safety itself. Every report that reached the courts of Europe carried the same message. These were not raiders. This was conquest. Systematic, ruthless, unstoppable. The Mongol commanders operated with a coordination that seemed impossible across such distances. Their scouts ranged hundreds of miles ahead. Their intelligence network knew the politics of every principality, every rivalry, every weakness. They struck where defenses were thinnest, withdrew when resistance hardened, and returned when their enemies had let down their guard. And the killing was not random, it was pedagogical. Cities that resisted were obliterated so completely that neighboring towns would surrender at the mere sight of Mongol banners. Those who submitted were sometimes spared. Those who fought were made into lessons. By early 1241, the Mongol northern wing, under the command of Orda Khan and generals Kaishan and Baidar, had carved a path of destruction across Poland. They were moving west, fast, and every day they advanced brought them closer to the heart of Europe, to the German principalities, to Bohemia, to the gates of the Holy Roman Empire itself. The lords of Christendom sent desperate messages to one another. Reinforcements were mustered. Alliances were proposed. Prayers were offered in every cathedral from Prague to Paris. But the Mongols moved faster than prayers, and now that unstoppable storm was coming straight for Liegnitz. Henry the Pious understood what most of Europe refused to accept. No one was coming to save him in time. He was Duke of Silesia, Duke of Krakow, a man in his 30s who had inherited a fractured realm and spent his life trying to hold it together. He was called the Pious, not out of mockery, but respect. He had founded monasteries, supported the church, ruled with a sense of justice his subjects trusted. But piety would not stop what was coming. The Mongol northern wing was days away, maybe less. King Wenceslaus of Bohemia had promised reinforcements, a full army, thousands strong, well-equipped and battle-tested. But Wenceslaus was still gathering his forces. He would not arrive for at least another week. The King of Hungary had sent word that he too was marching, but he was even farther away, locked in his own desperate struggle against Batu's southern wing. Henry knew the mathematics of the situation. If he waited for help, the Mongols would ravage Silesia unopposed. If he retreated, They would burn Liegnitz and everything west of it. If he scattered his forces to defend multiple cities, the Mongols would destroy them piecemeal. There was only one option: meet them in open battle. Buy time. Hold the line long enough for reinforcements to arrive and trap the Mongols between two Christian armies. It was a strategy built on hope and sacrifice. Henry gathered his commanders in the great hall of Liegnitz Castle. The room was cold despite the fires. Outside, the city prepared for siege, or worse. Families packed belongings, priests heard confessions, blacksmiths worked through the night repairing armor and sharpening blades. "We march in 2 days," Henry said. His voice was steady, but those who knew him saw the weight in his eyes. "The Mongols are moving toward us. If we wait, they choose the ground. If we strike first, we force them to respond." One of his captains, a scarred veteran of border wars, spoke carefully. "My lord, the reports say they number in the tens of thousands." "They do. And we have fewer." Henry cut him off, not unkindly. "Far fewer. But we have something they do not." The room waited. "We have a reason to stand." It was not a rousing speech. It was not meant to be. These were men who understood what was being asked of them. They would ride out knowing the odds. They would form a line knowing what breaking that line would mean for their families, for their homes, for every soul west of the battlefield. Henry dismissed them and stood alone in the hall. He thought of his wife, his children, the people who trusted him to protect them. He knew help was coming, but not in time. They gathered in the fields outside Liegnitz over 2 cold spring days, and even together they looked impossibly small. 300 knights. These were not common soldiers. These were the military elite of Christian Europe, men who had trained since boyhood in the art of mounted warfare, who wore 60 pounds of steel plate and mail, who rode war horses bred for size and aggression. Each knight represented years of expense, training, and tradition. They were living weapons, the answer Europe had always relied on when faced with existential threats. But 300 was not an army. It was a forlorn hope. The Teutonic Knights came first. Warrior monks, their white surcoats marked with black crosses. They had spent decades fighting pagans along the Baltic frontier. They were used to being outnumbered. They did not speak much, but their presence radiated grim competence. Then the Templars arrived, fewer in number, their red crosses vivid against white cloth. They had seen combat in the Holy Land and knew what it meant to face an enemy that did not fight by European rules. They understood the Mongols better than most. The speed, the deception, the willingness to sacrifice terrain for tactical advantage. The Hospitallers came with them, their black surcoats and white crosses a mirror image of the Teutonics. These men had held fortresses against impossible odds. They knew how to die well. Alongside the military orders came the Silesian nobles and their household knights, men who had fought beside Henry for years, who owed him personal loyalty, who would not abandon their duke even when strategy screamed for retreat. Their armor was well worn, their horses were not as large as those of the military orders, but they knew the ground and they would not break easily. And behind the knights came the levy. Thousands of them, peasants and townsmen, miners and farmers, men with pikes and spears and axes, men who had never seen real battle, men who had heard the stories from the East and volunteered anyway because their homes were next. They were not disciplined, they were not armored, but they were there. Henry rode among them, showing his face, speaking quietly to clusters of men who looked up at him with something between hope and terror. He did not lie to them. He did not promise victory. He simply thanked them for coming. At night, the camp was subdued. Fires burned low. Men checked their equipment again and again, finding comfort in routine. The Teutonic Knights prayed in formation, their voices rising in Latin hymns that sounded like both defiance and farewell. Some men wrote letters they hoped would reach their families. Others simply sat in silence, staring east. Everyone knew the Mongols were close. Scouts had reported sightings, small groups of riders, always distant, always watching, vanishing the moment Christian patrols moved toward them. It was unnerving. The enemy was there but not there, a ghost army that could materialize anywhere. One of Henry's commanders approached him at dawn on the second day. "My lord, we have word from a merchant who escaped the Mongol advance. He says their numbers—" Henry waited. "He says we will face 10,000, perhaps more." The Duke nodded slowly. He had suspected as much. They did not know yet that they would face 10,000 alone. The Mongols did not appear like a conventional army. They appeared like a plague. For 3 days, as Henry's forces marched east toward the anticipated battlefield, Mongol scouts shadowed them. Not dozens, hundreds. They appeared on ridgelines at dawn, silhouettes against the rising sun, then vanished before cavalry could reach them. They emerged from tree lines at dusk, observed the Christian camp, and melted back into darkness. They were always there and never there. It was psychological warfare, and it was working. The European soldiers grew tense, jumpy. Every distant movement became a potential ambush. Every shadow could hide a mounted archer. Sleep came hard. Sentries stared into darkness, gripping weapons, seeing threats that might or might not be real. And then the feigned retreats began. Small Mongol units, 30, 40 riders, would appear within bowshot of Henry's vanguard. The knights would form up, prepare to charge, and the Mongols would flee, not in panic, in formation, controlled, drawing the Christians forward. The first time it happened, a young Silesian noble took the bait. He led 20 knights in pursuit, thundering after the retreating Mongols, certain he was about to catch them. The Mongols stayed just out of reach, leading the knights farther and farther from the main force. Then they stopped retreating. They turned, fired. A storm of arrows from composite bows that could punch through mail at close range. 3 knights went down in the first volley. The rest retreated in chaos, dragging wounded with them. The Mongols did not pursue. They simply vanished. Henry ordered his men to ignore all provocations. No pursuits, no breaking formation. The Mongols were trying to fragment his force, to isolate units and destroy them individually. He would not give them that satisfaction. But discipline frayed under constant pressure. Smoke appeared on the horizon. Not from campfires, but from burning villages. The Mongols were scorching the earth, destroying supplies, creating refugees that clogged roads and spread panic. Every burned settlement sent a message. "We are already behind you." Mongol horsemen appeared at river crossings Henry needed, forcing detours. They poisoned wells. They left dead horses in streams. They used every trick Subutai had perfected over decades of campaigning, not just to weaken the enemy, but to make the enemy question every decision. Where were the main Mongol forces? How many were there? Which direction would they strike from? Henry's scouts brought conflicting reports. A large Mongol force was seen to the north. No, to the east. No, splitting into multiple columns. Every report contradicted the last. It was impossible to know what was real and what was deception. On the night of April 8th, Henry made his decision. They would march to Liegnitz and form a defensive position on open ground near the village of Liegnitz. If the Mongols wanted battle, they would have it on terms as favorable as Henry could manage. His commanders agreed. What choice did they have? None of them knew they were doing exactly what the Mongols wanted, and Henry walked straight into their design. Dawn came cold on April 9th, 1241. Fog lay thick across the fields of Liegnitz, reducing the world to grey shapes and muffled sounds. The Christian army formed in the pre-dawn darkness, knights in the centre, armoured and grim, the levies spreading out on either side, trying to look like more men than they were. Henry the Pious sat motionless on his warhorse at the centre of the line. He wore full plate armour, the steel cold against his skin even through padding. His banner, the Black Eagle of Silesia, hung limp in the still air. Around him, the 300 knights of the military orders prepared in silence. They knew This was not a battle they were likely to survive. They had made peace with that. As the fog began to thin, they saw the Mongols for the first time. Not a portion of them, all of them. The entire northern wing of the Mongol invasion, perhaps 10,000 strong, spread across the plain in formations that looked almost casual in their confidence. Light cavalry in loose clusters, heavier cavalry in reserve, and behind them, barely visible in the thinning fog, the siege engines and supply trains that marked this as not just a raiding force, but a conquering army. The Christians felt their hearts sink. This was not a vanguard. This was the full weight of the Mongol war machine, and reinforcements from Bohemia were still days away. Someone nearby whispered a prayer. Others joined. The words blended together, hundreds of voices, asking God for strength they did not feel. Henry raised his hand. The line steadied. Lances came down. Horses stamped, sensing the tension in their riders. Across the field, the Mongols did not charge. They waited, patient, letting the Christians see exactly what they faced, letting fear do its work. Mongol drums began. A low, rhythmic thunder that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The sound resonated in European chests, in bones, a heartbeat of dread. And then, as if coordinated by some invisible signal, the Mongols began to move, not toward the Christians, away. The entire Mongol line, 10,000 riders, began a controlled retreat, pulling back across the plain, opening distance, baiting the Christians to follow. Henry stared. His mind raced. This was the feigned retreat, the tactic that had destroyed Polish armies, Hungarian forces, every Christian army that had faced the Mongols. Chase them and die in a storm of arrows. Stay put and watch them burn the countryside. Beside him, a Teutonic commander spoke quietly. They expect us to charge. I know. If we do, they will destroy us. I know. The Mongols continued their withdrawal, moving just fast enough to tempt pursuit, slow enough to seem catchable. Henry looked at his 300 knights, at the levy beyond them, at the fog still clinging to the edges of the field, at the distance to the Mongol line. He thought of his wife, his children, the thousands of souls depending on this moment. And then the Mongols vanished, only to reappear where no one expected. The fog became an enemy. What remained of the morning mist drifted across the field in patches, obscuring sight lines, turning distance into guesswork. And the Mongols used it like a weapon. They did not vanish completely. They reappeared on the flanks, not in front of the Christian line where Henry had braced for impact, but spreading wide, impossibly wide, their light cavalry flowing like water around the edges of the European position. Within minutes, what had looked like a retreating force transformed into an encirclement. The Christians felt the trap closing. Mongol horse archers began their work. They did not charge. They circled. Staying just beyond effective range of European crossbows, they fired from horseback at angles that seemed impossible. Shooting backward while riding forward, loosing arrows while wheeling their mounts, maintaining volleys that never stopped. Arrows fell like rain, not the wild scattered fire of panicked soldiers, but disciplined, aimed shots. The Mongols targeted the levy first. The unarmored peasants had no defense against the composite bows. Men fell screaming, arrows punching through leather jerkins and padded cloth. Others raised shields, only to have subsequent arrows find their legs, their necks, the gaps in their desperate defenses. The levy began to break. Not all at once. In pieces. A section on the left flank scattered first, men throwing down their weapons and running. Then another group faltered. The Mongol arrows followed them, cutting down the slowest, driving the rest into panicked flight. Henry wheeled his horse, shouting orders, trying to hold the line together. But how do you stand against an enemy you cannot reach? The Mongols stayed distant, circling, firing, moving with a coordination that felt choreographed. Every time a gap opened in their encirclement, it closed before the Christians could exploit it. The knights remained steady. Armor deflected most of the arrows that struck them, but not all. Mongol archers aimed for horses, for the joints in plate armor, for the visors of helmets. A hospitaller went down when his destrier took 3 arrows to the chest and collapsed. A Templar's horse reared in pain, throwing its rider, and Mongol arrows found him before he could rise. The sky grew dark with shafts. A Teutonic sergeant near Henry took an arrow through the gap between his breastplate and helmet. He slumped forward, dead in the saddle, his horse carrying him in a slow circle before stopping. This was not battle. This was execution. The Mongols fired from 3 sides now, their encirclement nearly complete. The Christians compressed inward, knights forming a tighter formation, trying to shield what remained of the levy. But compressed troops made easier targets. The arrow storm intensified. Henry looked across the killing ground at the Mongol heavy cavalry in the distance. They had not moved. They sat their horses, watching, waiting for the arrow storm to finish its work, before they would sweep in to annihilate what remained. The mathematics were simple. The Christians could not stay here. They could not retreat. They could not defend against enemies on all sides. Henry had one option left, and it meant death. Chapter 7. The decision formed in Henry's mind with brutal clarity. If they stayed, they would die slowly, cut down by arrows until nothing remained. If they fled, the Mongols would run them down from behind. But if they charged, if they concentrated every ounce of armored violence into a single point and broke through the Mongol line, they might shatter the encirclement. They might reach the heavy cavalry before the horse archers could reposition. They might take enough Mongols with them to matter. Henry raised his voice above the chaos. "Knights, on me!" The 300 heard him. They understood immediately. This was not a command to hold position. This was a call to attack, to stop being targets and become weapons, to trade a slow death for a chance, however slim, of breaking the enemy's will. The knights formed a wedge. It happened with practiced efficiency, despite the arrows still falling around them. The Teutonic knights moved to the center, their heavy war horses and full plate making them the tip of the spear. The Templars and Hospitallers formed the sides. The Silesian nobles filled the gaps. 300 knights, 60 pounds of armor each, riding war horses bred for impact, forming a single massed instrument of violence. A priest rode along the forming line, shouting prayers in Latin, giving absolution to men who had no time to confess individual sins. He raised his hand in blessing over the knights. Some bowed their heads. Others simply stared forward at the Mongols, their faces invisible behind visors, their humanity reduced to steel and will. Henry took his position at the front of the wedge. Not because tradition demanded it, though it did. Not because his men needed to see him lead, though they did. But because if this charge failed, he wanted to be among the first to fall. He would not ask his men to die in a gamble he was unwilling to share. His standard bearer moved beside him, holding the Black Eagle of Silesia high. The banner caught what little wind existed, snapping once, a defiant marker in the killing field. The Mongols saw the formation and understood what was coming. Their horse archers intensified their fire, trying to break the charge before it began. Arrows struck knights at close range, some punching through armor, most glancing off steel plate with metallic shrieks. Horses screamed. A Hospitaller's mount went down, and the knight kicked free of the stirrups, scrambling to his feet, only to be trampled as the formation tightened around him. The wedge held. Lances came down. 300 points, each one 12 feet of ashwood tipped with steel. The knights lowered them in unison, the motion transforming the wedge into a forest of killing instruments. Sunlight, what little broke through the smoke and fog, glinted off steel. Behind them, what remained of the levy watched in awe and terror. They had never seen anything like this. The knights looked like something from legend, invincible, terrible, a force that could not be stopped. Henry knew better. He knew exactly how mortal they were. He knew the odds. He knew that somewhere behind Mongol lines, commanders were already adjusting, preparing counters, setting traps within traps. But there was no other choice. He raised his sword. The blade caught the light. For a moment, the entire battlefield seemed to hold its breath, and then the horns sounded. The charge began slowly, 300 war horses moving from standstill, gaining speed, the ground trembling under their weight. The knights leaned forward in their saddles, lances braced, becoming one with their mounts and their armor and their purpose. The Mongols did not flee. The nearest group of horse archers tried to scatter, wheeling their lighter mounts away from the approaching juggernaut. But they were too close. The European charge had begun at a distance, calculated to give maximum acceleration. By the time the Mongols realized the knights were not bluffing, it was too late to fully escape. The wedge accelerated, 30 miles per hour of armored violence. The sound was like thunder compressed into hoofbeats. The ground shook, dust rose. The Mongol horse archers fired desperately at point-blank range, but momentum was against them now, and then the wedge hit. The impact was cataclysmic. Lances punched through Mongol riders, through their horses, through leather armor and bone. The leading edge of the charge was a line of killing force that simply erased everything in its path. Mongol warriors disappeared under churning hooves. Horses collided with horses in explosive force. Bodies tumbled, blood sprayed across steel plate. The Teutonic knights at the tip of the wedge crashed through the first line of Mongols like a battering ram through kindling. A Mongol tried to wheel his mount away and was caught by a lance that went through his chest and out his back, lifting him from his saddle before the shaft shattered. Another took a lance through the throat. Another was simply trampled, horse and rider going down under the weight of armored destriers. The wedge did not slow, it pushed deeper. The Templars and Hospitallers on the flanks of the formation used their lances like scythes, catching Mongols who tried to escape laterally. A Templar's lance broke against a Mongol's shoulder, and he released it without hesitation, drawing his sword and continuing forward, cutting down at enemies who could not get clear. The Mongol horse archers tried to reform, to use their mobility to escape and counter. But the European charge was too fast, too concentrated. For every Mongol who escaped, 2 more were caught in the grinding advance of heavy cavalry. The wedge smashed into a second Mongol formation. This group had more time to prepare, to spread out, to avoid the direct impact. It did not matter. The knights adjusted their line, widening slightly, catching Mongols who thought they had moved to safety. A Hospitaller's lance took a Mongol commander through the side, the force lifting him out of his saddle and throwing him 10 feet. His horse bolted, riderless, adding to the chaos. Bodies carpeted the ground behind the charge, Mongol and horse. The earth was churned into mud, mixed with blood. And the Mongol line broke, not the entire force, but the wing directly in the path of the charge, perhaps 1,000 riders, shattered. They scattered, retreating in disorder, their formation destroyed, their cohesion gone. Some tried to rally, others simply fled. The horse archers, who moments before had been executing a perfect encirclement, were now fighting for survival, trying to escape the steel-clad nightmare crashing through their position. For the first time in the battle, the Mongols tasted fear. Henry felt it as much as saw it. The enemy before him was no longer coordinated. They were reacting, defensive, broken. His wedge had done the impossible. It had shattered a Mongol formation through sheer violence of impact. The knights pressed forward, their lances now mostly broken, drawing swords and maces, continuing to kill. A Teutonic knight rode down a fleeing Mongol and crushed his skull with a flanged mace. A Silesian noble caught another with a sword cut that nearly severed the man's arm. The European levy, watching from behind, began to cheer. The sound was thin, ragged, but it was hope. The 300 had broken through. They had done what no European force had managed in this entire campaign. They had made the Mongols run. But the Mongols were not finished. The Mongol retreat was a lie. What looked like panic was practiced doctrine. The shattered wing fell back, but they did not scatter randomly. They withdrew in a pattern, drawing the European wedge deeper into the killing ground, pulling the knights away from what remained of their levy, stretching the charge until it began to lose cohesion. And behind the retreating horse archers, the Mongol heavy cavalry finally moved. These were not the light skirmishers the knights had just routed. These were the shock troops of the steppe, warriors in lamella armor, riding larger horses, carrying lances and sabers, trained to meet heavy cavalry head-on and destroy them through superior numbers and discipline. They came from both flanks. Henry saw the trap closing and shouted a warning, but his voice was lost in the noise of battle. The wedge had spread out during the charge, losing its concentrated punch. Individual knights found themselves separated from the main formation, surrounded by enemies who had stopped retreating and started killing. The Mongol horse archers turned. They did not flee anymore. They circled back, moving around the now dispersed knights, firing at close range. And at this distance, arrows found every weakness. They struck horses in the eyes and throats. They found the gaps between armor plates. They punched through chainmail that had already been weakened by previous impacts. A Templar's horse collapsed, legs cut from under it by arrows. The knight hit the ground hard and tried to rise, but a Mongol lancer was already there, the spear taking him through the side where his armor had gaps for movement. Another knight was surrounded by 5 Mongol horse archers. They circled him, firing repeatedly. His armor held against most of the arrows, but his horse took a dozen shafts and went down thrashing. The knight fell, tried to stand in 60 pounds of steel, and could not rise fast enough. Mongol sabers finished him. The wedge was disintegrating. What had been a unified formation of 300 was now clusters of knights fighting for survival, each group isolated, each one being swarmed by Mongol cavalry that moved faster, repositioned constantly, struck and withdrew before the Europeans could respond. The Teutonic knights tried to reform around Henry's banner. 50 of them managed to reach the standard, forming a defensive circle, but they were deep in Mongol territory now, surrounded on all sides. Arrows came from every direction. A Teutonic sergeant took a shaft through his visor slit and fell without a sound. Behind them, the European levy was being overrun. Without the knights to protect them, the peasant soldiers faced the full Mongol assault. Horse archers swept through their lines, firing point blank. The levy had no answer. They broke completely, men throwing down weapons and running, only to be ridden down by Mongol cavalry who killed them from behind. The screaming carried across the battlefield. The sound of slaughter. Henry's wedge had broken a Mongol wing, had done what seemed impossible, but the cost was catastrophic. The knights were separated, surrounded, being killed in small groups by an enemy that refused to give them the stand-up fight, where European armor and strength would dominate. A Hospitaller near Henry took 3 arrows in rapid succession. One glanced off his shoulder plate. One embedded in his thigh. The third found his neck above the gorget. He fell, and the Mongols were already moving to the next target. The Mongol heavy cavalry closed in. They did not charge recklessly. They advanced in formation, lances ready, waiting for the horse archers to weaken the European knights before delivering the final blow. Henry looked around at the shrinking circle of survivors. Perhaps 80 knights remained mounted. More were on foot, their horses dead, trying to fight in armor designed for mounted combat. They were being picked apart. The knights had broken a wing, but the Mongol noose was closing. Henry the Pious refused to run. He could have. His horse was still strong. The Mongol encirclement was not yet complete. A small group of knights could have broken out, could have retreated toward Liegnitz, could have lived to fight another day. But Henry stayed. He stayed because the men around him were dying for a decision he had made. He stayed because running would mean the Mongols would butcher the wounded, would pursue what remained of his army back to Liegnitz, would burn his duchy while he fled. He stayed because sometimes a duke's duty is to die with his men. His standard bearer was still alive, still holding the black eagle of Silesia high, despite 3 arrows embedded in his shield arm. Knights rallied to the banner, forming a shrinking circle of steel and defiance. The Teutonic knights formed the outer ring. They fought with mechanical efficiency, their training overriding fear. A warrior monk caught a Mongol lance on his shield, deflected it, and brought his sword down across the rider's collarbone. Another Teutonic turned his horse into a Mongol attack, using the animal's weight as a weapon, scattering enemies. But there were so many. For every Mongol that fell, 3 more appeared. The horse archers maintained constant fire. Arrows struck the circle from all directions. A knight's horse went down, and before he could rise, Mongol cavalry were on him. Another took an arrow through the eye slit of his visor and toppled backward off his mount. The circle contracted. 60 knights now, then 50. Henry fought with desperate efficiency. His sword was notched from deflecting Mongol weapons. His armor bore the marks of a dozen arrow impacts. His horse was bleeding from cuts across its flanks, but still moved, still obeyed. A Mongol heavy lancer charged him directly. Henry caught the lance on his shield, felt the impact jar his entire body, and struck back with his sword. The blade caught the Mongol's shoulder, cut through leather armor, drew blood. The Mongol wheeled away, wounded but alive. Beside Henry, a Silesian noble he had known since childhood took an arrow through the throat. The man made no sound, simply fell from his saddle, dead before he hit the ground. The Mongol commanders had committed their full strength now. This was no longer about tactical advantage. This was about annihilation. The European knights had hurt them, had broken their formation, had killed hundreds. The Mongols would make sure none escaped to tell the tale. The heavy cavalry charged the circle from 3 directions simultaneously. The impact shattered what remained of European cohesion. Knights fought individual battles now, no longer a formation, but isolated warriors trading their lives as expensively as possible. A Templar took 2 Mongol lancers with him before falling. A Hospitaler's horse crushed a Mongol rider before arrows brought both down. Henry's standard-bearer finally fell, 3 arrows in his chest. The Black Eagle banner dropped, and a Teutonic knight immediately grabbed it, holding it aloft even as Mongol weapons struck him from all sides. Henry was unhorsed. An arrow struck his destrier in the eye, and the animal reared in agony, throwing him. He hit the ground hard, the impact driving air from his lungs. 60 pounds of armor made rising difficult. He got to one knee, raised his shield against a storm of arrows, and tried to stand. A Mongol lancer came at him from the side. Henry saw the attack too late. He tried to turn, to bring his sword up, but the lance caught him in the gap between his breastplate and pauldron. The steel point punched through mail, through flesh, exiting through his back. He fell. The pain was distant, almost abstract. He was on his back, staring at the sky. The sky had gone dark with arrows. They fell like rain, like judgment, like the end of everything. Around him, the last knights died. A Teutonic warrior fought from his knees, his legs shattered, killing a Mongol with his final swing. The last Hospitaller stood over Henry's body, protecting his duke even in death, until a Mongol saber cut him down from behind. The circle broke. The Mongols swept over the position, killing the wounded, stripping the dead of valuables, taking heads as trophies. Henry the Pious, Duke of Silesia, died surrounded by the bodies of the 300 knights who had followed him into legend. The Battle of Liegnitz was over. The Mongols had won. They had destroyed a Christian army, killed a duke, secured their position in Poland. By any measure of medieval warfare, this was a complete victory. But here is what most histories do not tell you. The 300 knights, in their desperate charge, had killed upwards of 500 Mongol warriors. They had broken an entire wing of the Mongol formation. They had delayed the invasion by crucial days. And perhaps most importantly, they had proven that the Mongols could bleed. What followed was not victory, but the beginning of a legend. The silence came first. After hours of screaming horses, clashing steel, and the constant hiss of arrows, the battlefield fell quiet. The quiet was worse than the noise. It was the sound of absence, of lives ended, of a world fundamentally changed in the span of a single morning. Bodies covered the field of Legnicki Pole. European knights lay where they had fallen, still in their armor, their steel plates stained with blood and dirt. Some had died instantly, speared or crushed. Others had bled out slowly from arrow wounds, their final moments spent staring at a sky that offered no mercy. The 300 who had charged into legend were scattered across a quarter-mile of trampled earth, each one a story that would never be told. Among them lay Henry the Pious. His armor was dented, pierced in multiple places. His sword lay nearby, broken halfway up the blade. Someone had already taken his helmet. His face, visible now, looked younger than his years. Peaceful, almost, as if death had lifted the burden of command. The Mongols moved among the fallen with practiced efficiency. They collected ears. This was not cruelty for its own sake, but military administration, a way to count enemy dead, to verify kills, to report accurate numbers to commanders. Mongol soldiers moved through the corpses systematically, their knives working quickly. Some gathered the ears in sacks. Others collected more gruesome trophies, heads of knights who had fought particularly well, commanders whose identities needed to be confirmed. They found Henry's body and recognized what they had killed. A duke, a prince of Christendom. One of their officers ordered the head taken as proof. It would be displayed, sent to commanders, used to demoralize other European forces. European survivors, those who had not died in the battle, were rounded up. Perhaps 200 men from the original levy, caught trying to flee, too wounded to run. The Mongols herded them together, wrists bound, faces blank with shock. Some wept. Others stared at nothing. They had watched the knights die. They had seen the impossible courage and the inevitable end. What would happen to them was uncertain. The Mongols sometimes enslaved captives, sometimes executed them, sometimes released them specifically to spread terror about what they had witnessed. Mongol casualties were collected separately. The dead were fewer than European losses, perhaps 500 killed, maybe twice that wounded. But by Mongol standards, this was significant. Individual Tumans had conquered entire kingdoms with fewer losses. The European charge had cost them. The Mongol commanders gathered on a rise overlooking the battlefield. They discussed what had happened with the same analytical detachment they brought to every engagement. The European heavy cavalry charge had been more devastating than anticipated. The knights had broken through experienced troops, had killed skilled warriors, had very nearly disrupted the entire tactical plan. This was valuable intelligence. It would be reported. Future campaigns would account for it. But for now, the battle was won. The Christian army was destroyed. The Duke was dead. The path west lay open. Mongol scouts were already riding ahead, seeking the next target. Engineers began cataloguing captured equipment, European swords, armor, anything that might be useful or studied. Burial details worked through the afternoon, dealing with the dead in the efficient, emotionless way that made the Mongols such an effective military machine. By evening, the field was mostly cleared. Mongol wounded were treated. Horses were tended. Camp was established. The army rested, recovered, prepared for the next phase of the invasion. Europe was wide open before them. Hungary was engaged with the southern wing. Bohemia's reinforcements had arrived too late. There was no organized resistance between the Mongol northern wing and the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. They could march on Prague, on Bavaria, on the German principalities that had never faced an enemy like this. The commanders discussed routes, supply lines, strategic targets. The campaign would continue. The conquest would proceed. But the Mongols were nowhere near finished. Henry the Pious had bought Europe 6 days. It does not sound like much. 6 days against the weight of history, against the momentum of the largest invasion force the continent had ever faced. What difference could 6 days possibly make? Everything. Here is what Henry's stand accomplished. When King Wenceslaus of Bohemia learned that Henry had engaged the Mongols at Liegnitz, he was still 2 days' march away with his full army. Thousands of fresh troops, well-equipped, organized, ready for battle. He pushed his men hard, hoping to arrive in time to trap the Mongols between two forces. He arrived on April 10th, one day too late to save Henry, but just in time to prevent a pursuit. The Mongols, bloodied by the Battle of Liegnitz, low on arrows after the sustained combat, with hundreds of wounded who could not ride at full speed, faced a choice. They could engage Wenceslaus immediately, fighting a second major battle with reduced strength. Or they could withdraw, regroup, and choose better ground. They withdrew. This was not defeat. This was tactics. But it meant the Mongol advance stopped. The relentless westward push that had terrified Europe for months halted at the fields of Liegnitz. Those 6 days Henry bought allowed Wenceslaus to fortify his position, allowed Hungarian forces under King Bela to retreat to defensible positions rather than being caught in open country, allowed the scattered German principalities to begin organizing a coordinated response instead of being conquered piecemeal. The psychological impact was equally significant. Before Liegnitz, every encounter with the Mongols had been catastrophic for European forces. Cities fell, armies were annihilated. The Mongols seemed unstoppable, supernatural, an apocalyptic force that could not be resisted. But at Liegnitz, 300 knights had charged 10,000 Mongols and broken their line. Yes, they died. Yes, the battle was a tactical Mongol victory, but they had proven the Mongols could be hurt. That European heavy cavalry, used with desperate courage, could shatter even elite steppe formations. This knowledge spread faster than the Mongols could march. Refugees from Liegnitz carried the story west. They told of Henry's sacrifice, of the knights who rode to certain death and took 500 Mongols with them, of the Mongol wing that broke and ran before European steel. The narrative mattered. Europe went from resigned terror to desperate hope. If 300 could do that much damage, what could 3,000 do? What if every kingdom committed its full strength? Military leaders began studying Mongol tactics seriously. The feigned retreats, the encirclement strategies, the horse archer doctrine. European commanders started developing counters, refusing to pursue obvious baits, using terrain to limit Mongol mobility, fortifying positions that would force the Mongols into costly sieges. Meanwhile, in Hungary, King Bela used the time Henry bought to retreat behind fortified lines. The Mongols under Batu Khan won the Battle of Mohi, a devastating victory that nearly destroyed the Hungarian army. But Bela survived. He withdrew to Croatia, to island fortresses the Mongols could not easily assault. He bought more time, waiting for winter, waiting for the Mongols to overextend themselves. The invasion that should have conquered Europe in months was now grinding into a stalemate. Not because European forces were winning battles, they were not, but because they were buying time, trading space for survival, forcing the Mongols to slow down. And time, as it turned out, was the one thing the Mongol Empire could not afford. Because while the warriors fought in Europe, a political earthquake was occurring 4,000 miles away in the steppes of Mongolia. But destiny had another twist. In December of 1241, 8 months after the Battle of Liegnitz, Ögedei Khan died. He was the great Khan, the supreme ruler of the Mongol Empire, the son of Genghis Khan, the man whose authority stretched from Korea to Poland. He died of alcoholism and excess in the capital of Karakorum, collapsing during a drinking session, his health ruined by years of indulgence that his advisors had warned against. His death changed everything. Here is what most people do not know about why the Mongol invasion of Europe ended. It was not European resistance that stopped them. It was not the Battle of Liegnitz or any other tactical victory. It was not terrain or weather or fortifications or military genius. It was Mongol succession law and internal politics. When a great Khan died, all princes of the blood were required to return to Mongolia for the Kurultai, the gathering that would elect the next supreme ruler. This was not optional. This was not negotiable. Every prince, every major commander, every potential claimant to the throne had to be present, or risk losing their claim to power and potentially their lives. Batu Khan, commanding the southern wing in Hungary, was a prince of the blood. He received word of Ögedei's death in early 1242. He had a choice: continue the conquest of Europe or secure his position in the succession struggle that would determine the future of the empire. He chose power. The order went out. The Mongol forces would withdraw, not retreat, withdraw. The Western campaign was suspended. All forces would return to Mongolia. The European invasion, the largest military operation in Mongol history, the campaign that should have conquered the continent, ended not with battle, but with bureaucracy. Batu pulled his southern wing out of Hungary in the spring of 1242. Order and the northern wing withdrew from Poland around the same time. They did not flee. They left methodically, burning what they did not need, taking plunder and prisoners, maintaining discipline even in withdrawal. Europe watched in confused relief as the unstoppable horde simply left. Christian chroniclers called it a miracle, divine intervention, God's hand protecting Christendom. Prayers of thanksgiving were offered in every church from Krakow to Rome. The Pope declared that Christian resistance had turned back the pagan horde. But the truth was simpler and more arbitrary. The Mongols left because their emperor died, because internal politics mattered more than conquest, because even the most powerful military force in the world operated within systems that could be disrupted by random events. If Ögedei had lived another year, Batu would have conquered Hungary. The northern wing would have pushed into Bohemia and Germany. The Mongol Empire would have extended to the Atlantic. European history would have been fundamentally different. No Renaissance as we know it, no age of exploration, no colonial empires. The entire trajectory of Western civilization would have changed. But Ögedei died, and Europe survived by accident. This does not diminish what Henry and his 300 knights accomplished at Liegnitz. They still bought crucial time. They still proved the Mongols could be resisted. They still gave Europe hope when hope was in short supply. But they did not stop the invasion. Time and politics did that. Here is the deeper truth, though. Henry could not have known any of this. When he rode out on April 9th, 1241, Ögedei was still alive. The great Khan would not die for another 8 months. Henry made his stand, believing the entire weight of the Mongol Empire would continue grinding west, regardless of what he did. He sacrificed himself and his men for time Europe desperately needed, not knowing that time would be granted anyway by events beyond his control. That makes the sacrifice no less meaningful. Perhaps it makes it more so. True courage is acting when you believe the cause is hopeless. When you fight not because you will win, but because fighting is the only moral choice available. Henry the Pious and his 300 knights embodied that kind of courage, and this is why Liegnitz still matters. The popular understanding of the Battle of Liegnitz gets almost everything wrong. Let's correct the record. Myth number 1. Liegnitz was a total Mongol victory that proved European military inferiority. Wrong. Yes, the Mongols won the tactical engagement. Yes, Henry's army was destroyed. But the Mongols suffered casualty rates they rarely accepted, upward of 5% killed in a single battle. For context, the Mongols conquered most of China, Central Asia, and Russia, with casualty rates far lower. Liegnitz was costly enough that the Mongol commanders paused their advance. That is not the hallmark of an easy victory. The European charge broke a Mongol formation. This was supposed to be impossible. Mongol doctrine specifically countered heavy cavalry. Yet 300 knights, outnumbered 30 to 1, shattered an experienced wing through sheer violence of impact. That is not military inferiority. That is a tactical success nested within a strategic defeat. Myth number 2. The European knights were ignorant medieval brutes charging mindlessly at a superior enemy. Wrong again. Henry and his commanders understood exactly what the Mongols were doing. They recognized the feigned retreats. They knew about the encirclement tactics. They had intelligence from survivors of earlier battles. They were not stupid. They were trapped. Their choice was not between a smart strategy and a dumb one. It was between dying slowly under arrow fire or charging and taking as many Mongols as possible with them. They chose the latter. That is not ignorance. That is calculated desperation. The military orders, Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonics, were among the most sophisticated military organizations in medieval Europe. They studied their enemies. They adapted tactics. They understood combined arms warfare. Calling them ignorant is historically illiterate. Myth number 3. European technology and tactics were hopelessly outmatched by Mongol superiority. Partially wrong. The Mongols had significant advantages in mobility, reconnaissance, and operational flexibility. Their composite bows outranged European crossbows. Their communications network was superior. Their logistical systems were more efficient. But European heavy cavalry was the most powerful shock force in the world. Pound for pound, a fully armored knight on a warhorse was nearly invincible in close combat. The problem was getting close. The Mongols understood this and designed their entire tactical doctrine to prevent close engagement. When the Europeans did close the distance, as at Liegnitz, they were devastating. 500 Mongol casualties from 300 knights is a kill ratio that proves European arms were not inferior, just employed in conditions that negated their advantages. The real lesson of Liegnitz is about tactical deception and strategic flexibility. The Mongols won because they controlled the terms of engagement. They forced the Europeans to fight at range, in open terrain, without support. Under those conditions, Mongol victory was nearly certain. But change the conditions, put the same forces in a mountain pass, in a fortified city, in broken terrain that limits cavalry movement, and the outcome could be very different. European forces eventually did learn to fight the Mongols more effectively, using terrain and fortifications to negate Mongol mobility advantages. Myth number 4. The charge at Liegnitz was pointless heroism, with no military value. Absolutely wrong. The charge bought time for survivors to escape. It prevented a Mongol pursuit that would have annihilated the scattered levy. It killed enough Mongols that the invasion paused for regrouping. It demonstrated that European heavy cavalry could break Mongol formations, which influenced defensive planning across Europe. Most importantly, it showed that resistance was possible. The psychological impact of the charge mattered more than the tactical details. Europe needed to see that someone would stand, that someone would fight, even when the odds were impossible. That courage still existed in a world that seemed to be ending. Henry gave Europe that symbol. The 300 gave Europe that proof. Their deaths were not pointless. They were the price of buying hope. The modern tendency is to view medieval warfare through a lens of technological determinism. Whoever has the better tech and tactics wins. But history is more complex. Morale matters. Timing matters. Politics matter. Random chance matters. Liegnitz was not a story of inevitable Mongol victory over backward Europeans. It was a story of a desperate stand that bought just enough time, followed by a political accident in Mongolia that ended the invasion. Both elements were necessary. Without Henry's stand, Europe might have fallen before Ogedai died. Without Ogedai's death, Henry's sacrifice would not have been enough. And yet, the story is still not over. 8 centuries have passed since 300 knights rode into legend on the fields of Liegnitz. The battlefield is quiet now. Farmland covers the ground where Henry fell, where the Teutonic knights formed their last circle, where Mongol and European blood soaked into soil that has long since absorbed and forgotten the violence. Tourists visit occasionally. There is a monument, a small museum, but most people pass by without knowing what happened here. That is the way with most history. It fades. The immediate urgency that made men willing to die becomes distant, abstract, a story told in textbooks and forgotten by the next generation. But Liegnitz should not be forgotten. Not because it was a great victory, it was not. Not because it changed the immediate course of the war, it barely did. but because it represents something fundamental about human courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Henry the Pious did not have to ride out. He could have retreated to his fortified cities. He could have waited for Wenceslaus. He could have abandoned Silesia to save his own life. No one would have blamed him. The Mongols seemed unstoppable. Survival was the rational choice. But Henry chose to stand. He chose to buy time for a continent that might not even use that time wisely. He chose to die so that others might live. The 300 knights did not have to follow him. They knew the charge was suicide. They knew the odds. They had seen what Mongol arrows did to armor, what happened to European forces that engaged in open battle. They could have scattered, could have fled, could have sought their own survival. But they formed the wedge. They lowered their lances. They charged. This is the meaning of Liegnitz. Not the tactics, or the casualty counts, or the strategic implications, but the simple fact that when everything screamed for retreat, 300 men chose to advance. History is full of practical decisions, calculated risks, strategic withdrawals. These are necessary. These are often correct. But history is also punctuated by moments when people choose honor over survival, when they decide that some things matter more than living another day. Liegnitz was one of those moments. The charge bought 6 days. 6 days for Wenceslaus to arrive. 6 days for Europe to prepare. 6 days that, combined with political events in Mongolia, allowed Western civilization to survive. But even if those 6 days had not mattered, even if the Mongols had swept west regardless, the charge would still have meaning. Because the 300 proved that courage exists, that sacrifice is real, that humans are capable of nobility even in the face of certain death. We live in a world that often mocks such concepts, that views medieval warfare as brutal and stupid, that reduces complex human decisions to cold strategic calculation, that sees in Liegnitz only a tactical defeat, a minor skirmish in a war that ended by accident. But that view misses everything important. Henry and his knights remind us that individuals can matter, that choices made in extremity define character, that sometimes the right decision is the one that leads to death, but preserves something more important than survival. Europe did not fall to the Mongols, not because of superior tactics or technology or divine intervention, but because people like Henry bought time. Because the 300 killed 500. Because resistance, even doomed resistance, creates space for the improbable to occur. The Mongols never returned to Europe. Ogeday's death fractured the empire into competing khanates. Batu established the Golden Horde in Russia, but never again threatened the West. The invasion that should have reshaped world history became a footnote, remembered in Eastern Europe, but barely known elsewhere. Except here, on this field, where 300 men decided that buying 6 days was worth 300 lives. The monument at Liegnitz Pole is not large. It does not need to be. The names of all 300 are not recorded. Most died anonymously, known only to God and the comrades who fell beside them. But their collective act is remembered. 300 men rode to stop 10,000. They did not survive, but Europe did. And history remembers them for that reason. Not for winning, for standing, for proving that even when the world is ending, courage is possible. That sacrifice means something, that 6 days can be worth dying for. 800 years later, we still tell their story. That is the victory, not on the battlefield, where they fell, but in memory, where they live forever. 300 knights who charged into darkness and became light.